Professor Klaxon had 3 eyes, 4 arms, and absolutely zero patience for what he called primitive species, which unfortunately for me included humans. The guy looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a really angry librarian, and he had the personality to match. "Today, class," Klaxon announced, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining quantum physics to houseplants, "we will observe the most dangerous predator in known space." I shifted in my seat, which was designed for someone with tentacles instead of legs. The Galactic Academy really needed to work on their human-friendly furniture situation. Around me, my classmates perked up with interest. There was Zephyr, a blue-skinned Altarian, who could literally taste fear, and Grex, who looked like a walking pile of rocks but was surprisingly chatty once you got past the whole communicating through electromagnetic pulses thing. "Behold," Klaxon continued, pressing a button that made the wall slide away with unnecessarily dramatic flair, "the razor claw of Epsilon Prime." The cage that rolled into view was the size of a small apartment and reinforced with enough energy shields to contain a small star. Inside, something the size of a grizzly bear paced back and forth, covered in what looked like armored scales that shifted from deep purple to angry red. It had 6 legs, a tail that ended in what could generously be called a morning star, and teeth that belonged in a medieval torture chamber. "No species," Klaxon said, clearly enjoying himself, "has ever successfully tamed, trained, or even communicated with a razor claw. They are pure, undiluted aggression made manifest." Zephyr raised one of her 4 hands. "What about the Cerebral Collective? They can mind meld with anything." "Tried," Klaxon replied smugly. 3 of their best telepaths are still in therapy. The creature's mind is apparently, quote, "a howling void of murderous intent," unquote. Grex's electromagnetic field pulsed curiously. The Hive Queens attempted pheromone manipulation. The razor claw ate half their diplomatic envoy before they could retreat. I watched the creature as it paced, noting how it kept sniffing the air and scratching at the floor of its cage. But before I could make any observations, Vex, a smug little gas cloud being, drifted over. "I suppose humans think they could do better," Vex wheezed through his translation device, "with your primitive emotional bonding techniques." The whole class turned to look at me. Great. Nothing like being the only human in a room full of allegedly superior alien species, who all thought your entire civilization was one step above banging rocks together. "Well, Murphy," Klaxon's 3 eyes focused on me with laser-like intensity, "do you think your species' crude methods could succeed where the greatest minds in the galaxy have failed?" I looked at the razor claw again. It had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at me through the energy barrier. For a creature of pure murderous intent, it looked more curious than homicidal. "Maybe," I said, which earned me a chorus of what I assumed were alien chuckles. This was going to be interesting. Klaxon's mandibles clicked together and what I'd learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a satisfied smirk. He was about to enjoy this. "Let me educate you, young human, about the failures of your betters," he said, gesturing dramatically with 2 of his arms, while the other 2 pulled up holographic displays. "The crystalline overlords of Proxima attempted telepathic dominance 3 cycles ago. The first hologram showed beings that looked like living diamonds trying to mind meld with a razor claw. It ended with the crystal beings shattering into thousands of pieces and screaming in harmonics that probably violated several noise ordinances. Their greatest mind shapers," Klaxon continued with obvious relish, "required complete memory reconstruction afterward. One still believes he's a potted plant." Vex wheezed what might have been laughter. "Surely the Hive Queens had more success with their biological mastery." "Oh yes," Klaxon said, pulling up another hologram. "The queens attempted pheromone manipulation, believing they could chemically compel obedience." This hologram was even worse. The insectoid queen approached the razor claw with confidence, releasing clouds of what were apparently mind control chemicals. The creature promptly went berserk, tore through its restraints, and started treating the queens like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The surviving queens evacuated their entire colony ship. 3 months, Klaxon said with satisfaction. 3 months before the queen's offspring stopped having nightmares about the encounter. While the professor continued his lecture of failures, I kept watching the razor claw. Sure, it looked dangerous, but something was off about the whole pure murderous intent description. The creature kept pawing at the ground in a specific pattern, and its head movements seemed almost repetitive, like it was stressed about something. "The Ethereal Consortium tried energy manipulation," Klaxon droned on. "The Machine Collective attempted behavioral programming. The Time Lords even tried temporal conditioning. All failures." Grex pulsed curiously. "What about the Empathic Union? Their emotional resonance techniques?" "Ah yes," Klaxon's 3 eyes gleamed. They lasted exactly 4.7 seconds before their lead empath curled into a ball and started speaking in tongues. Apparently the creature's emotional state is quote, like staring into a supernova of rage, unquote. But here's the thing. As I watched this supposedly rage-filled monster, it kept doing something that none of these brilliant alien minds had apparently noticed. Every few minutes, it would stop pacing, tilt its head, and sniff deeply in the direction of the class. Then it would scratch at the floor again, with what looked more like frustration than fury. "So you see, Murphy," Claxon said, all three eyes turning to me again. "When the greatest civilizations in the galaxy have failed using advanced science, psychology and technology, what exactly do you think your primitive species could possibly contribute?" The whole class waited for my answer. I could practically feel their smugness radiating across the room like heat from a star. "Well," I said, reaching into my backpack, "I was thinking maybe we could try asking what it wants first." The silence that followed my statement was the kind you usually hear right before someone gets thrown out an airlock. Kasim's three eyes blinked in sequence, like a malfunctioning traffic light. "Ask it what it wants," he repeated, his voice climbing about 3 octaves. "Murphy, this is a razor claw, not a lost tourist looking for directions to the gift shop." I pulled a small bag out of my backpack. It was nothing fancy, just a Ziploc bag filled with mixed berries I'd grabbed from the cafeteria for a snack. Blueberries, strawberries, a few blackberries that were probably past their prime, the kind of thing you'd pack for a hike back on Earth. The reaction was immediate and intense. Zephyr's 4 eyes went wide, her blue skin shifting to a pale green. "Murphy, what are you doing? Those are organic compounds." Grex's electromagnetic field pulsed in alarm. "Unprocessed biological matter. You could contaminate the specimen." Vex's gaseous form actually condensed with what I could only assume was shock. "He's going to poison himself. And probably all of us. Do humans have no sense of basic laboratory safety?" But here's what was interesting. The moment I opened that bag, the razor claw stopped pacing. Its head snapped toward me so fast I thought it might have given itself whiplash. Those supposedly murderous red eyes locked onto the berries with an intensity that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with interest. "Murphy," Kasim said, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper usually reserved for funeral homes and libraries. "Step away from the containment unit. That creature has killed 17 researchers across 4 star systems." "Has it though?" I asked, walking closer to the cage. The energy barrier hummed ominously, but the razor claw wasn't showing any signs of the violent behavior everyone kept talking about. If anything, it looked almost excited. Or have 17 researchers assumed it wanted to kill them and never bothered to figure out what it actually wanted? The creature pressed itself against the energy barrier, and I could hear a sound coming from deep in its chest. Not a growl, not a roar, but something that sounded almost like purring. A really big, really deep purr. "That's not possible," Kasim sputtered. "Razor claws don't purr. They're apex predators. They're killing machines. They're biological weapons designed by evolution to destroy everything in their path." "Yeah, well," I said, holding up a blueberry, "this biological weapon seems really interested in my lunch." The razor claw's 6 legs did a little dance, like a dog that knows it's about to get a treat. Its tail, the one with the supposedly lethal Morning Star attachment, was wagging. Actually wagging. Like a puppy. "Murphy." "No," Zephyr whispered. "This is how horror movies start. The human ignores all the warnings, does something stupid, and then everyone dies horribly." "Look guys," I said, turning to address the class while keeping one eye on the increasingly excited razor claw. "I grew up on a farm. My family raised animals. Cattle, pigs, chickens, and one particularly grumpy goat named Henderson who had a worse attitude than this thing. You know what I learned?" I held up another berry, and the razor claw's purring got louder. "Sometimes what looks like aggression is just frustration. Sometimes what looks like murderous intent is just hunger. And sometimes, when an animal is acting out, it's because nobody's bothered to figure out what it actually needs." "This is insane," Kasim declared. "The energy barriers are the only thing keeping that creature from tearing us all apart." "Is it though?" I asked, reaching toward the control panel. "Because right now, it looks like the energy barriers are the only thing keeping this guy from getting his snack." The entire class erupted in protests, but I was already pressing the button to lower the barrier. Because sometimes, when everyone tells you something is impossible, the best response is to prove them wrong with a handful of berries and a little bit of common sense. The energy field flickered and died, leaving nothing between me and the galaxy's most feared predator except 3 feet of space and a whole lot of confidence that everyone else was overthinking this situation. What happened next was probably the most anticlimactic moment in the history of xenobiology. The galaxy's most feared predator took one look at me standing there with a handful of berries, made a sound that was definitely purring, and very gently sat down like a well-trained dog waiting for a treat. The silence in the classroom was deafening. I could actually hear Vex's gaseous form vibrating with shock. "Good boy," I said, holding out a strawberry. The razor claw delicately took it from my fingers with surprising care, considering those teeth looked like they belonged in an industrial shredder. The creature's touch was so gentle I barely felt it. "This is impossible," Klaxon whispered, all 3 of his eyes tracking every movement. "Razor claws are carnivorous apex predators. They don't eat fruit." The razor claw, meanwhile, was savoring that strawberry like it was the best thing it had ever tasted. Its scaled hide shifted from angry red to a soft, contented blue-green, and that purring sound got so loud it was practically vibrating the floor. "Are they, though?" I asked, offering another berry. "I mean, has anyone actually studied their diet in the wild, or did everyone just assume that because they have big teeth and claws they must be meat-eaters?" I scratched behind what I assumed were the creature's ears. The razor claw immediately leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in bliss. "My neighbor back on Earth had a German shepherd named Brutus. Biggest, scariest-looking dog you ever saw. Everyone in the neighborhood was terrified of him. Know what Brutus's favorite food was?" The razor claw rolled over, exposing its belly in the universal animal gesture of trust and requesting pets. I obliged, and the purring got even louder. "Strawberries," I continued, rubbing the creature's surprisingly soft belly while my classmates watched in stunned silence. Brutus went absolutely nuts for strawberries. Would do backflips for a single berry, but everyone was so busy being scared of his teeth that they never bothered to find out what he actually wanted. Zephyr's voice was barely a whisper. It's letting you touch it." "Yeah, well, turns out when you're not trying to mind control, chemically manipulate, or temporally condition something, and instead just offer it a snack and some basic respect, most creatures are pretty reasonable." The razor claw had now positioned itself so I could reach the spot behind its head crest, and was making little contented chirping sounds. It sounded less like a terrifying predator and more like a really big, really happy bird. "But the research," Klaxon stammered. "The behavioral studies. The psychological profiles. Every expert in the galaxy has classified this species as irredeemably hostile." "Maybe," I said, feeding the creature another berry, "your experts were looking at stressed, scared, hungry animals trapped in cages and assuming that represented their natural behavior. This guy's probably been in captivity for months, fed nothing but whatever passes for institutional food in your research facilities, handled by people wearing environmental suits who treat him like a dangerous specimen instead of a living being." The razor claw had now rolled completely onto its back, all 6 legs in the air, tail wagging so hard it was creating a small windstorm. It looked absolutely ridiculous. It also looked completely, utterly harmless. "You know what else?" I continued, pulling out a blackberry. "I bet if you checked, you'd find that every single attack happened when researchers approached with restraints, sedatives, or weapons. Am I right?" Klaxon's mandibles clicked nervously. "Well, yes, but that's standard protocol for dangerous specimens." Or I said, as the razor claw gently took the blackberry and made little happy munching sounds, "It's exactly the kind of approach that would make any intelligent creature defensive and aggressive. If someone came at you with a stun rod and a straitjacket, you'd probably fight back too." Grex's electromagnetic field pulsed with what I was learning to recognize as confusion. "But how did you know?" "Same way I knew Brutus liked strawberries," I said, scratching under the razor claw's chin. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to what the animal was actually doing instead of what I expected it to do. This guy wasn't pacing because he was planning an attack. He was pacing because he was bored, stressed, and probably hungry for something other than whatever processed nutrition blocks you've been feeding him. The creature had now positioned its massive head in my lap and was purring so loudly that several of the smaller aliens had to adjust their auditory dampeners. It looked less like a fearsome predator and more like the galaxy's largest, most contented house cat. "Sometimes," I said to the room full of supposedly superior alien minds, "the most advanced solution is also the simplest one. Sometimes all a monster really wants is a friend and a decent snack." Professor Klaxon stood there for a full 30 seconds, all 3 eyes blinking in rapid succession like a computer trying to process an impossible equation. His forearms hung limply at his sides, and his usually perfect posture had devolved into something that looked like a deflated balloon animal. "This cannot be happening," he muttered, pulling out what appeared to be a holographic tablet. According to 17 different peer-reviewed studies, 4 doctoral dissertations, and a 12-volume encyclopedia on predator psychology, what you just did should be impossible. The razor claw, completely oblivious to the academic crisis it was causing, had discovered that if it rolled onto its side, I could reach the spot behind its shoulder blades that apparently needed scratching. The purring had reached jet engine levels, and it was now making little happy chirping sounds every time I hit the right spot. "Maybe," I suggested, feeding it another strawberry. "Your studies were wrong." Klaxon's mandibles clicked so rapidly, they sounded like a malfunctioning printer. "Wrong? Wrong? Young human, these studies were conducted by the finest minds in the galaxy. The Cerebral Collective's top behaviorists, the Hive Queen's most skilled psychologists, the Crystalline Overlord's premier xenobiologists. Are you suggesting that millennia of advanced research could be invalidated by a bag of primitive earth fruit?" "Well," I said, as the razor claw rolled over to let me scratch its belly again, "yeah, pretty much." The sound Klaxon made was somewhere between a shriek and a mechanical failure. But the aggression indexes, the hostility matrices, the predator-prey behavioral algorithms. "Professor," Zephyr said quietly, "it's playing fetch." She was right. I'd tossed a blueberry a few feet away, and the razor claw had bounded after it like an overgrown puppy, brought it back, and dropped it at my feet with an expectant look. "Good boy," I said, scratching behind its head crest. "Who's a good apex predator?" "You are. Yes, you are." Klaxon's eye stalks were now twitching independently. Stop that immediately. You're corrupting the specimen with your primitive anthropomorphic projection techniques." "Anthropomorphic projection," I laughed. "Dude, I'm just treating it like a living being instead of a research project. This is basic animal husbandry. First day stuff." "Animal husbandry." Klaxon's voice cracked. "This is advanced xenobiology. We're dealing with complex predator behavioral patterns, evolutionary aggression adaptations, and sophisticated territorial dominance hierarchies." The razor claw chose that moment to flop down next to me and start grooming itself like a cat. A really big, scaly, six-legged cat with a tail that could probably demolish a small building. Or, I said, it's a fruit-eating social creature that's been misunderstood, because everyone was too busy being impressed by their own complicated theories to notice the obvious. Grex's electromagnetic field pulsed with what I was starting to recognize as barely contained amusement. "The human may have a point, Professor. Perhaps our methodologies have been overly complex." "Overly complex." Klaxon spun around, all 4 arms gesticulating wildly. "We used quantum behavioral modeling, multidimensional psychological matrices, temporal causality analysis. These are the most advanced techniques in the known universe." "Yeah, and I used berries," I said, offering another strawberry to my new best friend. Funny how that worked out. Vex had condensed into the densest form I'd ever seen him take, which I assumed meant he was thinking really hard. "Professor, if the human's approach is successful, what does that mean for our understanding of predator species classification?" The question hung in the air like a particularly ominous storm cloud. Klaxon's 3 eyes went wide, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he realized the implications. "It means," he said slowly, "that every research paper, every classification system, every behavioral model we've developed for aggressive species could be fundamentally flawed." Or, I suggested, "it means that maybe calling something a predator and treating it like a monster becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe if you approach any creature expecting violence, that's exactly what you'll get." The razor claw had now positioned itself so that its head was in my lap, and was making contented rumbling sounds while I scratched behind its ears. It looked up at me with eyes that were now a warm golden color instead of the angry red they'd started with. "You know what's really funny?" I continued. "Back on Earth, we've got this saying, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Turns out you make more friends with berries than with stun rods and mind control techniques." Klaxon slumped into his chair, his academic worldview crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years of research, 17 scientific awards, 4 honorary doctorates, and I've been outsmarted by a human with a bag of fruit. "Hey," I said, as the razor claws started purring again, "don't feel bad. Sometimes the most advanced civilizations are the ones that forget the simple stuff. You guys were thinking so hard about the complex solutions that you forgot to try the easy ones." The creature had now gone completely limp with contentment, like a giant scaly puddle of happiness. It was hard to believe this was the same terrifying predator that had supposedly traumatized the galaxy's greatest minds. "Besides," I added, Look at it this way. You just learned something new. That's what science is supposed to be about, right? Testing assumptions, challenging theories, discovering new truths. Claxon looked up at me with something that might have been grudging respect. You realize, Murphy, that if word of this gets out, it will revolutionize the entire field of xenobiology. Cool, I said, feeding the razor claw another berry. Maybe next time someone encounters a dangerous alien species, they'll try offering it a snack before they break out the mind control rays. 3 weeks later, I'd become something of a legend at the Galactic Academy. Not the kind of legend I'd been hoping for when I applied to the most prestigious xenobiology program in known space, but apparently the human who domesticated death incarnate was the reputation I was stuck with. The Razorclaw, who I'd started calling Barry because of his obvious food preferences, had become the unofficial mascot of the xenobiology department. He followed me around campus like an oversized scaly golden retriever, much to the horror of visiting dignitaries and the delight of students who discovered that the galaxy's most feared predator would roll over for belly rubs if you asked nicely. Murphy, Claxon called out as I entered the classroom for our weekly seminar. His attitude toward me had shifted from condescending dismissal to grudging respect, with just a hint of existential dread. We have a situation. Barry bounded into the room behind me, his tail wagging so hard it knocked over a holographic display of molecular structures. Several students instinctively ducked, but he just settled down next to my desk and started purring loud enough to vibrate the walls. What kind of situation? I asked, scratching behind Barry's head crest while he made happy chirping sounds. The Ethereal Consortium has requested your assistance, Claxon said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd been forced to admit that everything he'd believed was wrong. They have a problem species. Zephyr leaned forward, her blue skin shifting to an interested purple. What kind of problem species? The Void Stalkers of Omega Centauri, Claxon replied, pulling up a holographic image of something that looked like a cross between a giant spider and a nightmare. Telepathic hunters that phase in and out of dimensions. They've been terrorizing shipping lanes for decades. No one has been able to communicate with them, let alone negotiate a peace treaty. I looked at the hologram, then at Barry, who was now upside down with his legs in the air, waiting for belly rubs. Let me guess. Everyone's tried the usual approaches. Mind control, pheromone manipulation, temporal conditioning, advanced dimensional mathematics, Grex added, his electromagnetic field pulsing with remembered frustration. Quantum consciousness bridging, reality anchor protocols. And how'd that work out? 3 research vessels destroyed, 17 diplomats presumed dead, and 1 cerebral collective philosopher who now communicates exclusively through interpretive dance, Claxon admitted. I gave Barry the belly rubs he was waiting for, and he immediately rolled over to let me scratch behind his ears. So basically everyone approached these void stalkers expecting them to be hostile, used a bunch of complicated techniques that probably scared or confused them, and then acted surprised when they fought back. The silence in the room was telling. You know, I said. Back on Earth we had a saying about assumptions. When you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Turns out that principle works pretty well in space too. Vex's gaseous form rippled with what I'd learned was curiosity. What would you suggest? Well, first I'd want to know what they actually want. Are they attacking because they're territorial? Because they're hungry? Because someone's been bothering them and they're defending themselves? You can't solve a problem if you don't understand what's causing it. Barry had now positioned himself so I could reach the spot behind his shoulder blades that made him purr like a small starship engine. 3 weeks ago this same creature had been classified as an unstoppable killing machine. Now he was basically a very large, very affectionate house pet who happened to have claws. The consortium is offering substantial compensation, Claxon said carefully, along with full academic credit for any successful resolution. I'll do it, I said, but I have conditions, such as, first, no weapons. No restraints, no sedatives or mind control devices. We approach them with empty hands and open communication. Claxon's mandibles clicked nervously. Murphy, these are dimensional predators we're talking about. So was Barry, I pointed out. Second condition, we bring snacks. Lots of different kinds. You never know what someone might be hungry for. Snacks, Claxon repeated flatly. Snacks, I confirmed. And third, we assume they're intelligent beings with their own motivations and desires, not monsters that need to be defeated or controlled. Barry chose that moment to grab my hand gently in his mouth and start play wrestling with it, making happy growling sounds that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him. To an outside observer, it probably looked like the galaxy's most dangerous predator was attacking a human. To anyone who'd been paying attention for the last 3 weeks, it was obviously just a big friendly creature playing with his favorite person. You realize, Zephyr said quietly, that if this works, you'll have revolutionized interspecies diplomacy across the entire galaxy. And if it doesn't work, Vex added, you'll be the human who got eaten by dimensional spiders. I shrugged, giving Barry one final scratch before standing up. Either way, at least I'll have tried treating them like people instead of problems. That's got to count for something, right? Klaxon sighed, a sound like air escaping from a deflated balloon. I suppose, Murphy, that your primitive human approach has yielded more positive results than our advanced methodologies. Hey, Professor, I said, heading toward the door with Barry bounding along beside me. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the simplest one. Sometimes all it takes to make friends with a monster is remembering that monsters are usually just people who haven't been understood yet. As we left the classroom, I could hear Klaxon muttering to himself about the fundamental flaws in galactic xenobiology protocols. But I also heard something else. The sound of students asking questions, challenging assumptions, and maybe, just maybe, learning that sometimes the best way to deal with the unknown is with curiosity instead of fear. Barry looked up at me with those golden eyes and made a contented rumbling sound. 3 weeks ago, he'd been the most feared creature in known space. Now he was my study buddy, my walking partner, and proof that sometimes the scariest looking problems have the simplest solutions. I just hoped the Void Stalkers liked berries as much as Barry did. If not, well, I'd have to figure out what they did like. After all, everyone's got to eat something. And who knows, maybe by the time I graduated, the galaxy would have learned that the best way to make friends with aliens wasn't through advanced technology or superior firepower, but through the radical concept of actually treating them like fellow sentient beings worthy of respect. It was a crazy idea, but then again, so was befriending a razor claw with a handful of fruit. And look how that had turned out.